Today we're making butternut squash soup. This stuff will warm you up on the coldest fall or winter evening. It's easy to make and it tastes rich and creamy, even though it doesn't have any cream in it. In fact, it's vegetarian, vegan, and gluten-free, so anyone can enjoy it. Let's get cooking. We're going to start our soup preparation with our butternut squash. This is a large butternut squash. It's just shy of 3 pounds or around 1,300 grams. And what we'll do is cut that in half and scoop out its seeds and roast it in the oven. I'm going to roast that at 425 degrees. So this, for me, apart from the slicing, is the easiest way to go about it. You can definitely peel your squash and chop it up and just do everything in your soup pot. Sometimes I've gone back and forth. Sometimes I thought that felt easier to me than taking the separate step of, well, I'm gonna slice in half here. There we go. That sometimes feels easier than taking the separate step of oven and then soup pot. But then you have to peel and chop the squash. Chopping isn't too bad. Peeling is a bit of a pain. As you can see, they're pretty tough. But today this feels easier to me. Of course, you can also take advantage of the peeled, chopped butternut squash that you can find at the produce area of lots of grocery stores. Go ahead and use that. And if you do that, or if you go ahead and peel and chop your squash yourself, you'll start by putting it all in a soup pot with some olive oil and salt and pepper and getting that squash cooked in there. We're going to roast ours though, so all we need to do now that we've cut that in half, and I did slice the top and bottom off, not strictly necessary, but it made cutting the squash in half a little bit easier and safer. I wasn't sort of struggling with the knife and a wobbly squash. So we're gonna scoop the seeds out, mostly onto the cutting board, a few for the kitchen counter, but we'll clean that up in a minute. All right, so we're gonna scoop that out of each half of the squash. And you could pull the seeds out of the pulp and roast them. You're not gonna get a ton of seeds out of that. So I honestly do just discard these, but you could certainly be a little more resourceful than that and roast yourself some squash seeds. All right, so relatively easy, easier than the pumpkin that you might be using for cleaning the seeds out of the pumpkin that you might be using for a jack-o'-lantern. All right, so ta-da, our squash is into halves, and we're going to just get a little bit of olive oil drizzled onto that. Some salt. We'll save the pepper for when we're actually seasoning the soup. But the salt doesn't hurt here as well. And I'm just gonna kind of rub that in a little bit. And make sure there's definitely oil across the whole surface there, because we're going to flip these over and roast them cut side down for about 40 minutes or so. It might take up to an hour, but 40 minutes should probably do it. So into the oven, 425 degrees, 40-ish minutes, and that should give us some nice tender squash. We'll check it in a little while. And in the meantime, we'll be getting the rest of our ingredients together. My squash has been roasting away in the oven for about half an hour, which has given me plenty of time to round up the rest of my ingredients. Those include the usual suspects, more olive oil, salt, and pepper, as well as some freshly ground nutmeg. I'm using vegetable bouillon. You can use stock or broth, homemade, even better, but I'll be using vegetable bouillon and just some water, a little brown sugar, a little cider vinegar, fresh sage, which is optional, but if you have it, great. Dried sage is great too, or not at all, up to you. And then some shallots. And I've already chopped my shallots, but I used about 3 shallots. If you have those on hand or can get a hold of them, those work particularly well with the butternut squash, but onion's great too. And if you use onion, maybe half of a medium onion for a large squash. All right, so I am heating olive oil, about a teaspoon or so, maybe a bit more, just a hair more than that, in my my Dutch oven. Use whatever pot you would make soup in to do all of this. And again, if you are not starting with that whole squash, or you've either got the chopped up squash from the store, or you peeled and chopped it yourself, that would be going into your pot as well at this point. All right, but here go my shallots, and I didn't chop these into a fine dice because we're going to be putting all of our vegetables into a blender to puree them anyway. So small, but you don't have to knock yourself out on it. So there they go into the oil. We can hear it's hot enough because it's sizzling, and we are going to try and cook those slowly. So find this nice wooden spoon for us to use. Gonna give that a stir. Let them cook on medium low for several minutes, and then we're going to salt them. I like to let my onions release some liquid and then salt them to help them, onions or shallots or what have you, and then salt them to help them retain some of the rest. All right, so we're gonna let these guys sizzle away. While those are sizzling, I am going to just roughly chop my sage, because we'll be adding that in a few minutes, and then we'll be checking on our squash a few minutes after that. My shallots have begun to brown. That's taken, about 8 to 10 minutes altogether. I did salt them already a little bit, and now I will add the chopped sage. This was about a 1/4 cup or so. Again, you can use dried, or you don't have to use any sage at all. Give that a little stir and add just a bit of olive oil as well. We'll also add a little bit of ground nutmeg. Fresh is great if you have it. Next, we'll put a little bit of black pepper, like so. And we'll be adding a bit more salt, pepper, and nutmeg once the squash goes in here, which is the next thing we'll do. Our squash is out of the oven after about 40 minutes. You can see that the skin on the top is blistered. And if your squash, move this stuff aside here, if your squash winds up sticking a little bit to your pan, never fear, because you could just use a spatula to pry it off. And again, we're not going to win any beauty contests with the squash. We are just trying to make sure that it is nicely roasted. So I'm going to flip this over, and you can see the other side of the saucepan there that it is nicely caramelized in places. If there are little bits that are stuck, we can just gently scrape them up. And then I'm going to be scooping big old chunks of squash right out of the skin. We don't need the skin, but I'm going to be scooping those out and just plopping them right into this pot. And we're going to toss that around with the sage and shallots and olive oil, and might again need to add just a bit more olive oil. Altogether, we'll wind up using maybe a tablespoon for the whole recipe. And we're just going to let some more surfaces of the squash take on a little bit of a brown color. There's a reaction that happens when when vegetables and meats and things caramelize, and we're gonna let that happen just to build a little bit more flavor before everything gets pureed. So keep putting the rest of the squash in here, and we'll take a look at that once it has spent a bit of time in the pot. Our squash has all been scooped out into the pot, and I've added a bit more salt, pepper, and nutmeg to it and let it cook for a few more minutes. At this point, it's already pretty well broken down, but it would be by no means smooth as a soup. So I am going to go ahead and put it into the blender. And for me, this is the easiest way to do it. If you have an immersion blender, it will work, but it always seems to miss bits. So if you want a smooth soup, you kind of can't avoid using a regular old stand blender or a food processor. I do think it's a little bit easier though, instead of putting all the liquid in and then trying to transfer hot soup in a couple of batches, to pause at this point and put the squash and shallot mixture into the blender as it already is, with just enough stock, or if you're going to go with bouillon and water, just enough bouillon and water to make it go around and into a nice puree. And then everything can go back into the pot, and you can add the rest of the liquid and let it simmer and kind of let those flavors melt together a little bit more. So for me, this is kind of the easiest way to go about it, and you don't have that awkward situation of having too much volume for your blender and having to kind of use a third container, which means making more dishes that probably you have to do, just to get everything pureed if you've got all of the liquid ingredients in there as well. All right, so I've turned my heat off. The pot's still pretty hot, but hopefully the bits that are left in here won't burn while we puree this. It is hot, so the mixture itself. So if you've never done this before, please do be careful, because when you turn that blender on, if you've got hot stuff inside, it will really want to come right out the top. So hold that carefully, maybe even pardon my reach, use a dish towel and kind of put that over the top. You know, if you're holding the lid of the blender on, put that over the top. All right, I will take advantage of this blending situation, since I'm using bouillon paste, to put all of my bouillon in, or I think all of what I'm going to use, which for me, is going to be about 2 teaspoons of bouillon. I didn't use a ton of salt earlier because this stuff is fairly salty, and I knew this would be going in. If you are using unsalted vegetable broth or stock, obviously adjust the salt accordingly. So my bouillon went in, and I've got 4 cups of water here. I'll probably use all of that, but not all in the blender. So I've put about a cup of water in the blender. That should be plenty to make this mixture into a nice puree, and then we can add the rest of the liquid once it goes back into the pot. So I will blend carefully, since this is hot. All together, my puree needed about 2 cups of water to become kind of a nice smooth consistency, and maybe you can kind of see that here, nice and smooth. Hopefully you can see that. So this is going to go back into the pot, and once we get this all scraped back in, we can turn the heat up about to medium or medium low and add the rest of our liquid. So I'm going to add, well, at least for now, another cup or so of water. Here it's going to depend on how thick you want your soup to be. I'm going to give this a good stir. And once I've got that mixed in, I will probably add the other cup to it as well. And the other additions we have here, if you'd like your butternut squash soup a little on the sweet side, and I would say taste your squash first and see how sweet it already is before you do this, you could add a little bit of brown sugar. You could do up to a tablespoon. I think mine's going to be fine with about a teaspoon or so of brown sugar, just to give it a little boost of sweetness. Or if you really want to play on the fall flavors, you could add just a little drizzle of maple syrup. All right, so I'm going to stir that into. At this point, if you haven't already done so, you probably want to taste for seasonings to make sure there's enough salt. Can you pick up on the nutmeg and the sage flavor? Do you need a little more pepper, etc.? And now that I've done that, I'm going to add this other cup or cup plus of water and let everything simmer for about 5-10 minutes or so, just to let the flavors come together that little bit more. And once we do that, we will add one last ingredient just to brighten it up, which is a little bit, maybe a teaspoon, 1 to 2 teaspoons of cider vinegar. And that will just help to brighten it up a little bit. If you don't have that, you could always use a little squeeze of lime or lemon. Lemon would probably be better with this flavor profile. Or just another, like maybe sherry vinegar, another type of vinegar, just to kind of brighten it up. It's not going to make it taste like vinegar. It will just really kind of make the flavors pop. All right, I'm going to let this hang out in the pot for a little while, come to just barely a simmer, and then we'll be adding that vinegar and we'll be just about ready to take a taste. I've added the apple cider vinegar and let the soup have a few more minutes to simmer. And now it's time to take a taste. Perfect. We hope you give this a try and you check back every Friday at 4 o'clock for a new recipe.